This is The Quiet End, and tonight I'll tell you a story titled The Clockwork Abyss. Let's begin. Deep beneath the surface, in the labyrinthine underworld known as the Iron Keep, brass lamps lined the vaulted tunnels, their sputtering light casting long, jagged shadows against the rust-streaked walls. For years, the city's heartbeat had been the rhythmic churning of the massive engine at its core, a machine so ancient and complex that no one truly understood its workings, not even Elias Rourke, the chief engineer. But tonight, that steady pulse faltered. Grinding gears and the screech of overstrained pistons broke the silence of midnight, a cacophony that clawed at the edges of sanity. Citizens were roused from their fragile sleep by the sound of steam vents hissing violently, the pressure rupturing pipes and sending scalding mists into the streets. Cracks spiderwebbed across walls, as though the Iron Keep itself strained against the unnatural disturbance. People gathered in tight clusters, wide-eyed and trembling as they glanced nervously at the ceiling above. The fear of a collapse always lingered. Elias Rourke, lantern in hand, made his way through the chaos, navigating the twisting paths toward the marketplace. His heart sank as he reached the square. It was there he saw it for the first time. Amid the stalls overturned and covered in debris, a monstrous figure lurched forward. It was a mass of tarnished gears, jagged metal limbs, and rust-black claws that dripped with what could only be described as oil and red stains. It moved with an eerie, jerking rhythm, its head, a grotesque orb with a single piercing glow, fixed on those who dared to scream louder than the machine itself. It didn't hesitate as it tore into the fleeing crowd, its claws slicing through flesh and fabric with ruthless efficiency. Bodies crumpled amidst shattered stalls, the remnants of lives shredded as steam hissed around the abomination like an angry ghost. Elias froze, breath caught in his throat. There was no blueprint for this, no explanation. The machine that powered the city was not sentient, or so they'd believed. He gritted his teeth and stepped closer, gripping his lantern until the metal frame dug into his palm. He needed answers. Answers the monster might not want to give. Elias Rourke's workshop, buried deep within the Iron Keep, was a sanctuary of order amidst chaos. Brass instruments, countless gears, and faded schematics covered every surface, relics of a machine whose mysteries he thought he'd mastered. But tonight, the sanctuary felt oppressive, as if the walls themselves were closing in. The echoes of the marketplace massacre still rang in his ears, each scream like a phantom whisper demanding answers. With trembling hands, Elias spread the largest blueprint before him, a map of the city's lifeblood, the great machine. He leaned in, his lantern casting flickering light across the parchment, tracing the layout he'd studied for decades. At first, it seemed familiar, predictable even. But then, in the corner of the page, his eyes caught something. A series of cryptic symbols penned in a hand not his own. The ink was darker, almost bruised, standing out against the schematic's otherwise meticulous annotations. The handwriting belonged to an enigmatic figure Elias had heard of only in rumors, the Artificer, the machine's original creator. These notes hinted at mechanisms buried deep beneath the visible layers, structures inexplicable and chillingly intricate. One phrase stood out most: "The unseen core breathes life." Elias murmured the words, feeling their weight settle like a shackle. What had the Artificer hidden, and for what purpose? As his mind raced, he began to notice a sound, soft, rhythmic, almost comforting at first. A ticking. He froze, thinking it to be the old clock above his desk. But the noise grew louder and sharper, until it drowned out even his racing heartbeat. Then he realized something horrifying. It wasn't coming from the clock. It was coming from the walls themselves. Panic surged through him as the workshop walls bulged outward. Metal groaned, gears twisted free from the plaster, and then, with a deafening crash, a claw ripped through the nearest wall. Its serrated edges glinted in the dim light, clockwork joints grinding with unnatural precision. More claws followed, shredding through blueprint-clad shelves and scattering tools like leaves in a storm. Elias stumbled backward, the lantern tumbling from his grip and shattering on the ground, extinguishing its flickering glow. Shadows surged as machines born of torment encroached, their ticking transforming into a deafening symphony of malice. He bolted for the door, each step feeling heavier than the last. He barely escaped as the walls of his sanctuary collapsed in a storm of metal fury, leaving him trembling outside, heart heavy with despair. The air grew colder with every step Elias Rourke took into the machine's lower levels. Armed with nothing but a worn wrench and the faint warmth of his lantern, he descended through a maze of rusted pipes and catwalks that swayed as though they might collapse at any moment. The walls were slick with oil, their sheen catching the lantern's light like a predator's glare. Somewhere in the depths, the grinding of gears had grown louder, angrier. It was no longer a mechanic hum, but something primal, something alive. The first shadows startled Elias, a pile of what looked like broken limbs. But as he approached, realization hit him like a hammer. They weren't just discarded scraps. These were failed constructs, twisted half-creations abandoned to rot. Metal arms spasmed weakly, if they could be called arms, reaching out with claws that never got a chance to sharpen. Pools of thick, black oil pooled beneath them, slick with streaks of crimson, as though veins remained tangled in their rusted bodies. One still clung to life, its head jerking unnaturally as it blinked a mechanical eye that cried sparks instead of tears. "What have we done?" Elias whispered, his voice lost in the symphony of grinding gears. He pressed onward, clutching his wrench tighter, his knuckles pale against the dark. The deeper he went, the more the constructs multiplied, lurking half-merged into the pipes, their dismantled bodies clinging to machinery like barnacles on a dying ship. But nothing could prepare him for what lay at the heart of the labyrinth. He stumbled upon a wall that seemed to pulsate, as though breathing in time with the machine. When he raised his lantern, bile rose in his throat. It wasn't metal. It wasn't a pipe. It was a wall built entirely out of human skulls. Hundreds of them. Their hollow eyes watched blankly, teeth clattering together in eerie sync with the rhythmic churn of the machine. Elias staggered back, the sound of bone on metal gnawing at his sanity. Yet his lantern revealed something more. In the corner, carved into the bone and framed by rusted wires, was the same phrase he had read on the blueprint. The unseen core breathes life. Only now, the words felt less like a riddle and more like a warning. Elias emerged into a cavernous chamber that dwarfed every structure above ground. Columns spiraled upward like contorted spines, their surfaces layered with spinning gears and pulsating brass, each movement so precise it was almost hypnotic. Steam hissed through winding pipes that crisscrossed overhead, creating halos of damp fog that clung to the darkness. The machine's pulse was alive here, its rhythmic churning less mechanical and more organic. Elias had felt dread before, but this was worse. This was certainty that he had entered the belly of something unholy. Dozens of them patrolled the chamber. Clockwork abominations, their forms now grotesquely refined from the failed constructs he'd left behind. Their movements were unnervingly synchronized, as if guided by one mind split into many bodies. Heads turned in perfect rhythm, claws grasped at invisible tasks. Each had glowing eyes, a sinister amber radiance that seemed to pierce the shadows. Elias crouched low, holding the lantern close. The flickering flame was his only companion, fragile against the black void around him. And then the sound came. From above, a resonant hum filled the chamber, deep and visceral enough to shake the rust beneath Elias's boots. But the hum morphed. It fractured and grew. It became a choir of voices, metallic and hollow, chanting in a language that seemed ripped from another realm. Elias couldn't understand the words, but their meaning sank deep into his bones. The machine hungers. His breath caught as the abominations stopped in unison, each head turning slightly toward the source of the chant. He used the pause to sneak between two columns, ducking under pipes that leaked viscous fluids onto the floor. Every movement was a gamble. Every step felt cursed. But just as he began to feel the safety of hiding in the noise, his lantern began to flicker. The tiny flame faltered once, twice, and then guttered out entirely, plunging Elias into darkness. The amber eyes of the abominations snapped to him, their glow gathering like stars, all fixed on one ill-fated man. Elias burst through a narrow opening, the pounding of his heart almost louder than the grinding gears behind him. The abominations were fast, but they moved with a deliberate rhythm that he'd outrun through sheer panic. Stumbling into the heart of the machine, the air changed. Dense, oppressive, and so thick with heat it felt alive. The core was unlike anything he'd imagined. A sprawling workshop stretched before him, cluttered with strange devices whose purpose seemed just beyond comprehension. Coils of copper glowed faintly, tubes hissed and sputtered, spewing vapor that danced like specters under the flicker of weak lamps. At the center of it all, slumped against a throne-like assembly of brass and iron, was a figure, a man, or what was left of him. The artificer. His decayed form was tethered to the machinery, cables fused deep into his flesh, some winding around exposed bone, others threading through desiccated organs. His face had long since lost its humanity, now a skeletal visage with empty sockets that pulsed faintly with light. When he spoke, his voice was more machine than man, low, grinding, and broken. "You've come at last." Elias froze, unable to look away from the spectacle, unable to speak. The artificer tilted his head, sluggish yet deliberate. "You misunderstand. The machine was never meant to nurture your city," he said, his voice alternating between human warmth and metallic rasp. "It was built as a cage." "A cage?" Elias stepped back, his wrench shaking in his hand. "A cage for what?" he demanded. The artificer's body shuddered, as though laughing, though no sound came. The surrounding gears spun faster, filling the room with an ominous hum. "Something older than your world. Something consuming. Centuries of neglect softened its bonds, and now it commands the machine." Elias looked to the core, a towering mechanism of jagged edges and shifting gears, pulsating as though it held a grotesque heartbeat. He rushed toward the console, past tables piled with dismembered machinery and skeletal remains of failed experiments. His eyes scanned the controls frantically, seeking a means to shut everything down. As he reached for a switch, the artificer's voice erupted. "Stop!" it roared, almost drowning the sounds of the machine. "Do you think shutting it down will save them? The purpose, it has changed." Elias hesitated, sweat dripping down his face. The artificer's chuckle echoed, hollow and wicked. "Flesh, flawed, weak. The machine sees perfection in clockwork. It will replace you all," he spat, his voice breaking into static before reforming into something unearthly. Eternal, endless, harmony. And as Elias pulled the switch, he realized with a sinking heart that the machine might not stop, but adapt. Elias cried out in fury, his hands grappling the switch with all his strength, desperate to end the nightmare. The machine roared in protest. Wires shot from the walls like serpents, entwining his limbs and wrenching him backward. Gears descended from above, spinning wildly, their razor edges slicing through the air. Elias fought, straining against the pull, but it was no use. The machine's hunger had reached its apex. As he was dragged toward the core, the artificer raised one skeletal hand, his decayed form vibrating violently as his flesh disintegrated into a swirling cloud of metal dust. The dust spiraled into the core, merging seamlessly with the churning brass and pulsating gears. "You cannot escape perfection," the artificer's fragmented voice whispered, now part of the machine itself. Elias screamed, his cry swallowed by the grinding symphony around him. Above, the iron keep shuddered as the machine began its final phase. Buildings collapsed into rubble. Citizens fled only to be caught by the abominations, their bodies twisted into grotesque constructs of flesh and metal. Their screams echoed through the tunnels, a cacophony of terror mingling with the ticking that now reverberated across the entire city. Steam burst through the streets in volcanic eruptions as the machine's hunger consumed everything. Elias struggled, reaching for his wrench, the last symbol of his humanity, the last tool he had. But the wires pulled him harder, and the wrench slipped from his grasp. In that fleeting moment, it clanged against the cold surface, tumbling into the abyss below. The sound was brief, swallowed by the relentless ticking, endless and unstoppable. The clockwork abyss had claimed him. It had claimed them all. So tell me, dear listener, if the ticking ever grows louder in the shadows of your own home, will you dare to find its source, or let the abyss claim you in silence? Subscribe for more chilling tales, and hit the bell to stay in the dark. See you at the next quiet end.